when the worshiper brings his offering to the entrance of the tent of meeting, he is making a journey symbolically into the presence of God in the highest heaven, and he can only go so far in that journey personally. He can only go to the entrance of the tent of meeting. He can't go any farther than that. And he lays his hand on the head of his offering and identifies with his offering. He becomes one with it, so that the offering becomes his vicar, his representative, and the offering also bears his sin. His sins are imputed to the animal, and the animal then suffers to the point of death, dying in the place of the worshiper. So the idea, again, is when it comes to the spirituality of the law is his path of ascension, and the worshiper has been obedient to the point of death. He has been obedient to the point of death in order to satisfy the penal sanctions of the law. Now, that's the end of the first stage of his journey into the presence of God, stage one, which is suffering. But that's followed by a second stage, which is his exaltation. Now, this, I think, is symbolized by the offering being placed on top of the altar. The altar itself is a miniature replica of the mountain. If you think, for example, of the glory fire spirit coming down onto the summit of Mount Sinai, it transforms it into a giant altar. And so the altar in the outer court is a miniature replica of that. And the fire on top of the altar is a symbolic replica of the glory fire spirit at the summit of the mountain. And just as when Moses entered into that pillar of cloud at the summit of the mountain, he was transformed in a partial glorification, so to speak, when he came down from the mountain, so too, when the offering is placed at the summit of the altar in the fire, it is transformed by the fire. It is symbolically glorified. It's smokeified, or heavenized. And once it is etherealized by the fire, it then ascends into the highest heaven in the form of a pillar of cloud. Now, we're speaking symbolically here, right? But again, the worshiper is the one who's making this journey, and he's doing it vicariously through his offering, which has been obedient to the point of death and which has now ascended to the summit of God's holy mountain and is now being transformed by the Spirit so that it ascends into the highest heaven. Now, that's the sacrificial system of worship, particularly the burnt offering, which is appended to the mother promise as a dramatic, symbolic pre-enactment of its fulfillment. But what happens symbolically here in the Old Covenant happens truly with Christ. Christ is the true worshiper, the true sacrifice. He's the true priest. He takes that path of ascension into the highest heaven, which takes him from suffering unto glory. He is obedient to the point of death, but he is also raised by the Spirit of God, glorified, transformed by the Spirit of God, and ascends to the highest heaven and sits down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. Now, there are, I think, many different places in the Old Testament that bear that out, and I pointed at a few of them. For example, Leviticus chapter 9 says that fire came out from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering. So the fire on the altar was a symbolic replica of the fire of the Lord. 1 Kings chapter 18 is another example. That's when Elijah called on the name of the Lord, and the divine fire fell and consumed the burnt offering.
He's a consuming fire.
And our God is a consuming fire, Exodus 24:17, right. And that he appeared as a consuming fire at the summit of Mount Sinai. So the fire at the top of the altar is a symbolic replica of God as a consuming fire. Now, one of the passages I think that makes this really clear, though, and I'll just point this out in closing, is in the book of Judges, chapter 13. Whenever the angel of the Lord appears to the soon-to-be parents of Samson, Manoah and his wife, he instructs Manoah to prepare a burnt offering, and when Manoah does and places it on the altar, Judges 13:20 says that the angel of the Lord went on top of the altar, on top of the burnt offering. And when the flame went up toward heaven from the altar, the angel of the Lord also went up in the flame of the altar. That to me was what really opened my thinking with regard to seeing the ascension offering, which, by the way, is a better translation of it than burnt offering, from the altar of ascension, a symbolic replica of the mountain of ascension. That to me is what made me start thinking about this is the symbolism here is the ascension of Christ. It's that of the ascension of Christ. What Christ did truly is symbolically being dramatically pre-enacted in the sacrificial cultus.